Welcome to the Multi-Taction Showcase tutorial series. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a content hotspot. Hotspots are an incredibly useful facility in helping someone navigate around a display area. Imagine if you had a map or a diagram or an image with lots of products on it, and you wanted somebody to be able to touch any of those objects and launch into more information about them. The way you do that is through a content hotspot. So literally you can draw that hotspot anywhere on the display area and then control what happens when somebody touches it. Before we jump into the editor though, let's review some of the key elements of a content hotspot. The first thing is what's called the hotspot visualization, which is what do you actually see at the point where you're touching. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. You could, if you wanted to, put an image on the backdrop, or for example, even if you had like a huge image that was just your backdrop image, and then you could draw content hotspots on top of that, or you could drop a new image on and make that image the hotspot itself. The second thing is what happens and where does it happen when someone touches that hotspot. And you have two options. You can launch around the location of the touch, or you can launch at an absolute location. So my kind of thoughts on this depend on the type and size of the display you're using. If you're using a very large video wall with lots of people interacting with the content in parallel, you probably don't want to launch at an absolute location, because pretty soon everybody's going to be dropping content on top of each other. So in that scenario, I would use a launch around the location. So if the content, wherever those content spots are across your whole display, if someone touches one of them, it literally launches the content right by where they are. If you've got a smaller display area though that has fewer people on it, and maybe even just one or two people at a time, launching the content at an absolute location makes more sense because you can incorporate that into your design. So if, for example, you left an area off to the left-hand side for where you wanted content to launch, you wouldn't necessarily be in the way of the other person who's trying to use the system at the same time and have content literally appear right in front of them. So it's a choice depending on, I think, governed by the type and size of display system that you're designing for. In the example that we're going to use today in the tutorial, we'll do it at an absolute location so that I can show you how to set that up. Okay, let's jump into the editor and create a content hotspot. For those of you that have watched previous tutorials, this will be a familiar display. What I've done is I've selected structures from the menu over here, and I'm looking at the structure for the tutorial application. From previous tutorials, we created our finger menu, we created our teaser menu, and we have our video background. So to add a new hotspot, we go over here and click on a new widget to add to main. And here's my content hotspot. Let's go ahead and add it. Before we do anything else, let's save. Let's expand this content hotspot widget and see what some of our options are. And straight away you can see the three things that we covered in the overview. So what's going to happen at the visualization area, so where the hotspot actually is. What do you want to have launched from the hotspot around the touch location, and what do you have launched based on a specific location on the screen. So before we do anything, we have to figure out where this hotspot's actually going to be and what's going to be the trigger for it. Will it be an image we load in, or will it simply be a set of coordinates for an image that already exists on the background? In this instance, we're going to use a logo, and we're going to have the logo launch into the website for the company, and we're going to put that in a specific location. So let's go ahead and get that done. Okay, so let's start by creating the hotspot, and first of all, I want to add a visualization, so I'm going to use an image viewer, and this will be the widget that I use to show the company logo, which I'll be using as my hotspot. Okay, let's look at some of these settings, which should be familiar to you now from some of the other tutorials. So location, where do I want it to be? Well, I don't want it stuck right up in the corner at 0, 0, which would be the default. So I'm going to bring it down and out just a little bit, so it's away from the edge of my display. Let's go ahead and save that. What about scale? Well, it's quite a small file, so I'm going to go ahead and make it 3 times the original size. I could set the actual size if I want to here in the initial size, but I'm happy with the scaling factor at this point. The next thing I want to define is the actual image file. So I go over to my media library, I look for my logo, I click and drag that straight into the window. So let's go ahead and save that. Okay, so a quick check in the application, and here's my logo now up in the top left hand corner, just 50 down and 50 across, which was the exact location, and then the scaling factor that I asked for. Okay, now we want this thing to do something when you touch it, so let's go back into the structure and the hotspot definition and define the thing that we want to have launch. So here I am back in the hotspot definition. So I want something to launch at a specific place. So I'm going to go ahead and select a web browser widget. So that's going to allow me to define the URL of the company website. So when anybody touches that logo in the top left-hand corner, it will put them straight into the corporate web page. But I do want it in a specific location. So location, actually, just as a point, the location option will appear also on the launch from around a hotspot, and that location then adds to the position. So for example, if the hotspot happened to be in the middle of the display and I set a location of 100, 100, then it will be 100 across and 100 down from that touch position. So again, as a rule of thumb, if you're launching from around the location, you probably don't necessarily need to set a location parameter because it's going to launch from wherever that touch point is. Whereas in my situation, I want it to be at a very specific place on the display, so setting the location parameters will be important for me. Okay, so let's set the location. Well, first of all, I want it to be about 1,000 pixels across and 50 down, just to move it down from the border. I'm not going to set a scale this time, but I'm going to set a specific size. So I want it to be about 1,000, I'll say 900 across and 1,000 down. Pin the widget when it opens is important if you want them to be able to navigate the website straight away, which I do. So when it first launches, if you don't pin it, it will be an object they can move around the display. When you specify that it's pinned at opening, then they can interact with the website straight away, which is what I want. So I'm going to enable that. The other thing I want to be able to specify directly is the URL, which I've typed in here. Now, this is another useful attribute you can set here, which is the address bar and navigation controls. If this is in a public place and you've got someone looking at your corporate website, you probably don't want them to look at anything else, but just stay within the website you've got defined. Equally, if you're launching a HTML5 app through the URL, you don't want them necessarily to be able to change the URL that you specified. If I set this to enabled, it will turn off the address bar and navigation controls, which means the URL that I launch for the person when they touch the hotspot is the only URL they will get. Everything from within that, so once they go to the corporate website, the links I have on there will be active, but this will stop them typing in another URL address and going somewhere different. So I'm going to set that in here and control that. Okay, the only other thing I'd like to add in is a close, so that they can close that if they want to. So let's have a look at my tutorial toolbar close only. Remember, we set that in previous tutorials, and as you know, I like things to close pretty quickly, so I'm going to use my tutorial fast close option and go ahead and save. So here we are back in the application. Let's go ahead, and if I touch anywhere in this icon up here, which is now set as my hotspot, it should launch into the website. So let's see. And yes, it does, straight into the web. Now you'll notice there is no, I can interact with the website as normal, but there is no URL bar across the top, so they can't navigate into something else that I don't want them to. And they can click on any of the links and navigate their way around the website. And once finished, it will time out by itself in 5 seconds, or they can click the X just like in previous ones. Okay, so let's review what we did. So back in the structure, and here's the content hotspot that I set up. The first thing we did was put an image viewer widget in, and that's how we managed to get the corporate logo to appear in the top left-hand corner. The next thing we did was we added a launch widget, which was going to be the web browser, and we did it from an absolute screen location. So remember, if I look at my attributes down here, we wanted it 1000 across and 50 down. We set a specific size for the window. Remember, we pinned it straight away so that they could interact with the URL. Now, before we leave this area, I want to leave you with an important tip. If you're creating a hotspot against a large image background instead of actually adding an image to be the hotspot, then sometimes it might be difficult for you to figure out exactly where that hotspot is. And to fix that, we've put a little feature in that allows you to turn on the hotspot so you make it visible and you can see it. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So if you go ahead and look at the actual hotspot, you'll notice there's a background color option down here. You'll also recall from previous discussions that if you set these parameters the right way, you can have a particular color highlighted, in this case, black. What that does is it fills in a black space according to where the hotspot is and how big you've created it. And this is the easiest way of very quickly determining where your hotspots are on a large image backdrop. In the case where we put an image in and used that as the touch point, it didn't matter because it was always going to be the size of whatever the image was that we put up there, and we knew exactly where that was going to be because we could see it. But if you're creating multiple hotspots against a background image where you're not putting specific images on, but you have to set the actual hotspot size, which you would do here from the hotspot size parameter, then the only way to know exactly where it is to turn on the background color. Now there is another option, of course, which is you could use something like an image animation so that there's something actually happening at those hotspot points. And I actually quite like that as a technique because when someone looks at a large background and doesn't know necessarily that there are things on there they can interact with, putting little indicators as to where those hotspots are, I think is a really good idea. It encourages people to interact with the content. So to wrap up, a quick review of the key elements. The hotspot visualization, remember we actually put our own image in and we made the decision not to launch at the touch location, which would be the launch around location, but we wanted it at a specific place. And so we put the web widget underneath the launch at absolute location. So that brings us to an end of the tutorial on how to create a content hotspot. Thanks for watching.